Welcome to Apex Storyteller, where peaceful stories guide you into the perfect night's rest. Before we start, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps me bring more soothing stories to you and others who need them. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, find your cozy spot, close your eyes, and let's begin this calming journey together. Change into new words. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet night at the small town of Hollow Creek. But when Emily returned to her childhood home, something felt off. A feeling she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The walls, the creaking floors, the old clock that hadn't worked for years, it all seemed too alive. And when she found the letter in her father's handwriting, addressed to her, despite him having passed years ago, it was too much. "Don't come back, Emily. It's already too late." That was the moment she realized, there's something inside this house. Something that doesn't want her to leave. But what happens when the past and the present collide in a place where no one dares to speak of what really happened? Will she uncover the truth, or will she become the next lost soul? Emily had never planned on coming back to Hollow Creek. Not after everything. Not after the whispers, the memories that haunted her even in her dreams. She'd left as a teenager, eager to escape the ghost of her past, and in all those years she hadn't looked back. But when the call came, the one from the lawyer saying her father had left her the house, she found herself standing at the edge of the town once again. Hollow Creek had always been a place where time stood still. The air had a certain heaviness to it, a thick, almost suffocating quality, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Or perhaps waiting for something to be forgotten. Emily's car rolled down the narrow, cracked streets, the tires crunching over the forgotten remnants of what used to be paved roads. The houses seemed abandoned, their windows dark, their yards overgrown with weeds that clawed at the sky like twisted fingers. It wasn't how she remembered it. The life she once knew here had long since died. She turned the car down the familiar lane leading to her childhood home, the old Victorian house that loomed like a silent sentinel at the end. As she parked, her hands trembled against the steering wheel. It had been years since she had seen it, years since she'd walked through its creaking halls. Yet something about it felt different, more oppressive. The house seemed to be watching her. Emily pulled her suitcase from the back seat, the weight of it feeling heavier with every step she took toward the front door. The old wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, a sharp sound that sent an eerie chill down her spine. The smell of dust and decay rushed to meet her, mingling with the faint scent of something old, like rotting wood. She hesitated at the threshold, the memories flooding back in a rush. She'd spent her childhood here, running through the halls, playing in the garden. But now, the house felt foreign, as if it had aged in a way she couldn't quite place. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. "Welcome home, Emily," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. She dropped her suitcase at the foot of the stairs and wandered through the darkened rooms. The walls, once vibrant with color and life, were now faded and peeling. The old furniture stood in place, covered in dusty sheets, as though the house had been frozen in time. But there was something unsettling about the stillness. The house wasn't just empty, it was watching her. It wasn't until she reached the study that she found it. Tucked beneath a pile of old newspapers on her father's desk was a letter, sealed in an envelope with her name written on it in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her father had died years ago, and she hadn't even been able to attend his funeral. She'd run, unable to face the pain that still lingered. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. The paper inside was old, yellowed at the edges, and crinkled with age. Her father's words seemed to leap off the page. "Don't come back, Emily. It's already too late." The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. She read them again, then again, but they made no sense. What did he mean by too late? Too late for what? As she stood there in the dim light of the study, the silence of the house grew heavier. The clock on the wall, which had been stopped for as long as she could remember, suddenly ticked. Once, twice. The sharp sound rang out in the stillness. A chill ran down Emily's spine, and she instinctively turned to leave the room. But as she did, her gaze fell on the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Her parents, smiling as if nothing was wrong, as if the past hadn't been filled with secrets that no one dared speak aloud. Emily stepped closer, her eyes narrowing on the image. For a split second, she could have sworn that her father's smile twisted into something sinister. Her breath caught in her throat and she quickly turned away, clutching the letter tightly in her hand. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just the house. It was something deeper, something that had been waiting for her all these years. Something that had never truly left Hollow Creek. She needed to leave. But then, as if in response to her thoughts, the door to the study slammed shut behind her, as though it had been waiting for her to make the decision. The sound reverberated throughout the house, echoing through the halls like a distant scream. Emily froze. She wasn't alone. The door slammed shut behind Emily with such force that it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The sound echoed in the house, reverberating in her bones. For a moment, she stood frozen, her breath shallow, the letter clenched tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded against her chest, the frantic beats almost deafening in the oppressive silence of the house. She turned slowly, her eyes darting around the study. The same eerie stillness hung in the air, but it felt different now. Like the house had changed in some subtle yet terrifying way since the moment she arrived. Emily reached for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, the room grew colder, an unnatural chill creeping down her spine. Her fingers brushed the brass handle, but she couldn't bring herself to open the door. Something told her it wasn't just the cold that would greet her on the other side, it was something far worse. Suddenly there was a sound, a soft, unmistakable scraping noise coming from the hallway. Her body tensed. Her head snapped toward the direction of the sound, her eyes wide with fear. It was faint, almost like the sound of something, or someone, dragging their feet across the floor. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. Her mind screamed at her to leave. Go back to the car. Call someone. Leave this place. But her feet were rooted to the floor, unable to move. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as if the very space around her was pressing down, suffocating her. She couldn't tell whether it was the house itself that was holding her captive or the fear that had paralyzed her. The scraping noise grew louder, closer. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, like a memory she couldn't quite place but knew all too well. She slowly moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the knob. The door was locked. It was as if the house itself didn't want her to leave. A low creak came from above her. Emily's eyes shot up to the ceiling, but there was nothing. Just the heavy darkness pressing down on her. Her breath came in shallow bursts as her gaze wandered over the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then something caught her eye, a figure standing in the far corner of the room. For a split second she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But then it moved. A man, barely visible in the shadows, stood watching her, his features distorted and unclear. His face seemed almost wrong, like it was melting into the darkness around him, his eyes hollow and wide, staring right through her. Emily gasped, stumbling backward into the bookshelf. Her hands knocked over a stack of old books, sending them crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice the noise. It just stood there, watching her, unmoving, as though it was waiting for her to make the next move. Tears stung the corners of her eyes. She didn't want to believe what she was seeing, but there was no denying it. She wasn't alone. And whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. Her heart thudded in her chest as she slowly backed away, her legs unsteady beneath her. She glanced toward the door again. Still locked. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, for some way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. The room felt like a trap, the walls pressing in on her, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The figure in the corner finally moved, but it wasn't toward her. Instead, it turned slowly, its head jerking unnaturally, as though its neck had been broken and then snapped back into place. The movement was so strange, so twisted, that Emily's stomach lurched, and she had to fight to keep from vomiting. It walked to the window, its movements stiff and unnatural. Emily watched, her body frozen with fear, as the figure reached out toward the glass. The window pane groaned in response, the sound almost like a whispered warning. Suddenly the figure stopped. It turned its head to face her again, its eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the figure spoke. "It's too late for you, Emily." Her blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't respond. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, a grim realization settling in. Whatever had happened here, whatever had brought her back to Hollow Creek, it wasn't just about her father. It was about something much older. Something that had been waiting for her, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. The figure stepped back into the darkness, its presence fading into the gloom, but the chilling feeling it left behind didn't dissipate. The air was still thick, heavy with something she couldn't understand. The house seemed to pulse with it as if alive, its walls vibrating with a low hum that made her skin crawl. Emily couldn't stay here any longer. She had to leave. But how? The scraping sound returned, this time louder, closer. It was coming from behind her. With a shaky breath, she turned around, her eyes wide with fear. There was no escape. Suddenly, the door to the study flung open with a loud bang. Emily froze, her heart stopping for a moment before she rushed toward it. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness, her mind racing for any way out. But as she reached the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks. The house was silent again. No scraping, no footsteps, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just the eerie quiet that seemed to envelope her. The door remained open as though inviting her to leave. But Emily knew better. The house wasn't done with her yet. Her father's warning echoed in her mind once more. It's already too late. Was it too late for her to leave? Or had something already changed inside the walls of this house, inside her? Emily stepped back into the hallway, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. She had come back to Hollow Creek to face the past. But now, it seemed that the past was ready to face her, and there was nowhere to hide. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts, her heart hammering in her chest as she stood frozen in the hallway. The eerie silence that followed her frantic escape from the study was almost worse than the noises that had plagued her moments before. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something she couldn't quite comprehend. She reached for the door handle again, her fingers trembling, but the moment her hand made contact, the door slammed shut with a force so violent that the sound rattled the windows. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls of the house were inching closer. The silence suffocated her, but just as she thought she might suffocate under the weight of it all, she heard it. A whisper. At first, it was so faint that she couldn't be sure it was real. But then it grew louder. A low, raspy murmur that seemed to seep out from the very walls themselves. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it was unmistakable. It was calling her name. Emily? Her blood ran cold, her legs unsteady as she took a step backward. The voice came again, louder this time, but still so hushed, like a breath just behind her ear. She spun around, eyes wide with panic, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the flickering lights overhead. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, but whenever she looked directly at them, they disappeared. Emily, don't ignore me. The whisper echoed in her ears, sending a chill down her spine. She stumbled backward, pressing herself against the wall for support. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it felt so real, so close. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as if someone, or something, was standing just behind her, breathing down her neck. Her eyes darted around the hallway. Nothing. Only darkness at the far end. Was she losing her mind? She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling that something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of her senses. The house had been abandoned for years, yet it was alive with an oppressive energy she couldn't explain. It was as if the very structure was a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsing with something darker than she could comprehend. The whispering came again, this time accompanied by a soft, dragging sound, like something, or someone, moving just beyond the walls. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, closer. It was coming from the walls. Emily's heart raced as she turned toward the source, the very idea that something, or someone, was trapped behind the plaster sending a wave of nausea through her stomach. The scratching grew more frantic, like nails being dragged against the surface, eager to escape, to break free. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The whispers too grew louder, more insistent, but this time they weren't just calling her name. They were speaking directly to her. You shouldn't have come back. You know what's here, don't you? Her blood ran cold. A jolt of fear shot through her, and she pressed herself harder against the wall, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingertips, the texture of it now sharp and suffocating. She had to get out. She had to leave. But where could she go? There was no escape. Not anymore. As if the house were reading her thoughts, the floorboards beneath her feet creaked, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, just out of view. She tried to make out the sound, tried to focus on what was happening, but her mind was spinning. The house was closing in on her, and she could feel the walls, the floors, the very air around her bending in on itself. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was maddening. The noise, the whispers. They were coming from everywhere at once, no longer isolated to one part of the house. They were in the walls, in the floors, in the ceiling. It was as though the entire house itself was alive, pulsing with something ancient and malevolent. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise had been. Emily held her breath, her chest tight, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Then, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The sound was coming from above her. Her eyes widened in terror as she looked up, but the hallway above was empty. There were no figures, no shadows moving in the dark. But the footsteps continued, slow and steady, like someone, or something, was pacing above her. Thump, thump, thump. Each step echoed louder and louder, filling her ears, rattling her nerves. The heavy sound seemed to get closer, as though whoever, or whatever, was walking up there was moving toward her. And then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. The air seemed to shift, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She could feel her heart thundering in her ears, her breath shallow as she waited, dreading what would happen next. But nothing came. Nothing but that suffocating stillness that seemed to be alive in its own way, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. She had to leave. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. Her eyes darted toward the staircase at the far end of the hallway. The house seemed to pull her gaze toward it, like a magnetic force drawing her in. The steps were dark, obscured in shadow, but she couldn't ignore the urge to climb them. The upstairs, the attic, the place where it all started. Something was calling her up there. Against every instinct in her body, Emily's feet began to move, drawn toward the staircase as if the house itself were guiding her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear swallowing her, but her legs wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. Step by step, she ascended the stairs, the creaking of the wood beneath her feet almost deafening in the silence. As she reached the top, the air grew colder. A freezing draft swept across her skin, and the faint smell of something rotting filled her nose. At the end of the hallway she saw it, the door to the attic. It was slightly ajar, and from the dark cracks around the edges, Emily could hear the faintest sound of movement. Soft, rustling. Something was up there. She reached for the door handle, her hands shaking uncontrollably. As her fingers closed around it, the door suddenly swung open by itself, as though pushed by an unseen force. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, but she stepped forward anyway, each step heavier than the last. Inside the attic it was pitch black. Cold. A suffocating kind of dark, the kind that made her skin crawl, like the shadows were alive and waiting for her to come closer. And then, as the door creaked shut behind her, Emily heard it, a voice clearer now, coming from the dark corners of the room. "Welcome back, Emily." The door slammed shut with a deafening crack. Emily's pulse raced as the door slammed shut behind her, the echo of it reverberating through her chest like a drumbeat. The thick darkness of the attic pressed in on her, so absolute that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The air smelled stale and suffocating, like it had been sealed off from the rest of the house for decades. It was as though the attic had been waiting for her arrival, waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. The voice in the shadows lingered, its words heavy with an unsettling familiarity. "Welcome back, Emily." It sounded like her father's voice, distorted, low, and tainted by something far darker. Her throat tightened, and she instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the cold, unforgiving wall behind her. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came from her mouth. The weight of the silence crushed her, forcing her to remain still, to listen. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice wasn't just her father's. It had a twisted edge to it, something ancient and malevolent. It seemed to swirl around her, coming from all directions at once, too close for comfort, yet she couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was as if the very darkness in the room had a voice, a presence that was aware of her every move, her every thought. The floor beneath her creaked. A low, ominous groan echoed through the attic, the sound like the groaning of old wood, but it felt far more sinister. It was a warning. Something was shifting in the shadows, something ancient and far beyond her understanding. She could feel it, the tension hanging in the air, the heaviness of it pressing down on her chest. It's not just the house, Emily. It's you. It's always been you. Her heart skipped a beat. The word sent a shockwave of cold fear through her veins and her stomach churned. What did it mean? Was it referring to her family's history? Her father's past? Or was it something else? Something darker that she couldn't even begin to comprehend? The scratching began again. This time it was louder, more frantic, almost desperate. It came from behind her, from the far corner of the attic. The sound was as if someone, was trying to claw its way out, trying to break free from the confines of the house. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her blood ran cold. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there. Only the inky blackness. You can't escape, Emily. The voice was everywhere now, surrounding her, closing in from all sides. It was like the very walls of the attic were whispering, taunting her, as if the house itself had become a living, breathing entity. She could feel its cold, suffocating fingers wrapping around her throat, choking the breath out of her. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the suffocating dark. She wanted to know, needed to know, who or what was behind the voice, the presence in the room. But she already knew the answer. Deep down, she'd known from the moment she stepped foot in this cursed house. It was never about her father. It was never just about the past. It was about something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for her, watching her, for far longer than she could understand. The shadows in the corner of the room stirred. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she slowly backed away, the darkness shifting in front of her, molding itself into a shape, a figure that moved with unnerving fluidity. It was too quick, too unnatural. She took another step back, her foot colliding with an old wooden chest. The sound was deafening in the quiet attic, and for a moment she thought she saw the figure freeze, like it was sensing her fear, feeding off it. Then it moved again. The figure stepped into the dim light, and Emily's blood ran cold. She barely recognized it at first. Her eyes were playing tricks on her, but then it became clear. It was her father. But not her father as she remembered him. His face was twisted, his eyes hollow and empty, his mouth contorted in a grin that made her stomach churn. His clothes were torn, as if he had been dragged through something far worse than time itself. And his hands, the fingers were elongated, gnarled, and twisted, like they had been shaped by something dark, unnatural. The nails were sharp, caked with something that looked disturbingly like blood. She could barely breathe as she stared at the figure. Her father, if it even was her father, reached out toward her with those monstrous hands, his lips curling back in a grotesque smile. His voice came again, this time a whisper that seemed to scrape against her very soul. "You shouldn't have come back, Emily. This is where it ends." Emily's knees buckled beneath her as she fell to the floor, her eyes locked on the creature that once resembled her father. This wasn't him. This couldn't be him. The man she knew had been kind, caring. But this was something else. This was something born of the house. Born of the evil that had lingered in the walls for generations. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, its hands reaching for her, and Emily screamed. She scrambled backward, her fingers brushing against the old chest as she tried to push herself up, but the figure was too fast. It was right there, hovering over her, its hollow eyes boring into hers, the smile stretching impossibly wide. "You're mine now." The words were like poison, sinking deep into her chest. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the suffocating presence of the attic consuming her every thought, every ounce of her being. The air was thick with the stench of decay and rot, the room spinning as if the very house were alive, twisting and turning to trap her within its walls. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure's grip tightened on her arm, its nails sinking into her skin, drawing blood, and she screamed again, desperate, helpless. But then the figure froze. Its hollow eyes flickered, and its smile faltered. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, a strange, inexplicable sensation beginning to wash over her. Something was changing. The figure jerked back, its body convulsing in a way that seemed inhuman. It twisted, its form bending and contorting, its face rippling as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. Before Emily could react, the thing let out an ear-piercing screech, so loud, so shrill that it shook the very foundation of the house. The walls trembled. The floor beneath her feet cracked. And then, in a blinding flash of light, the figure vanished, leaving Emily alone in the attic once again. But she wasn't alone. The shadows lingered, darker than before, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. And in the silence that followed, Emily realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Emily's breath was ragged as she sat there in the thick silence, her body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. Her head spun with disbelief, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The figure that had once been her father, the twisted creature, was gone. But the air in the attic remained heavy, as if it was still there, lingering, watching. For a long moment, Emily didn't move. She couldn't. The fear that had taken hold of her was too strong, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She could still feel the phantom touch of that monstrous figure's hands, its claws digging into her skin, even though she knew it was gone. But the strangest thing was the feeling that remained. Something wasn't right. Not just with the house, but with her. She could feel it deep within her, a strange unease, as if something in her was slowly shifting, changing. Was it because of the house, or was it because of what she had just seen? What was it that had drawn her back here? She could still hear that voice echoing in her ears, "You're mine now." The words replayed over and over in her mind, their sinister tone digging into her thoughts. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her like a shadow, wrapping around her with each passing second. But she knew she had no choice. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay in the attic any longer, not with that voice haunting her every step. She had to find the answers. She had to know what was going on. Her legs felt like lead as she stood up, the floor creaking beneath her feet. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands trembling. The cold air in the attic seemed to seep deeper into her bones, but she ignored it. She had no time to waste. She turned toward the attic stairs, her eyes scanning the room one last time. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything out of place. But the unease remained. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners, waiting for her to make the wrong move. As she descended the stairs, she heard the faintest whisper, a soft voice like a breeze brushing past her ear. It was the same voice that had spoken to her in the attic, the voice that had sent a chill racing down her spine. "Emily?" She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. The hallway was empty. The house was still. But the voice was still there. In her mind. "You can't escape." Her head jerked back in the direction of the voice. She knew that the house had a way of messing with her mind, of making her doubt what was real. But this felt different. This was something else. Something more powerful. She stumbled forward, her feet heavy as if the house itself were trying to pull her back. The voice was getting louder, more insistent, tugging at her thoughts. She clutched her head in her hands, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder. "You don't remember, do you? You don't remember what happened here?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. What did it mean? What had happened here? The house had been in her family for generations, she knew that much. But there was something more. Something buried beneath the layers of time. Something the house didn't want her to know. Her mind flashed back to her childhood. She could remember coming to the house on family visits, playing with her siblings, laughing, running through the old rooms. But those memories felt off, like they were missing something. Something important. Something that the house had erased. She pushed those thoughts aside and hurried down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. The front door was only a few feet away. She could feel the cool air from outside, the promise of freedom, the promise of escape. But as she reached for the door handle, something stopped her. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, moving like liquid, crawling toward her. The house had been quiet for too long. It was preparing for something. And then she saw it. The reflection. In the hallway mirror she saw a figure. At first it was just a shadow, but it became clearer with each passing second. She gasped, her hand freezing midair as her heart skipped a beat. It was her father. No, not her father, but a version of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his smile was twisted like the one she had seen in the attic. His mouth moved, but no sound came from his lips. "You can't leave, Emily. Not now. Not after all that's happened." The reflection reached out toward her, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, and Emily stumbled back, her hand dropping away from the door. The mirror's surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone, and for a moment, Emily thought she could see the room behind her, only it wasn't her house. It was something else. She felt the air grow thick, the room closing in around her. The mirror shimmered, and then the figure in the reflection was gone. But the room felt different now. The shadows felt deeper. The silence felt louder. Emily? It wasn't her father's voice anymore. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. Something that had been waiting for her. She had no time to think. She grabbed the door handle again, wrenching it open, and ran out into the night. But as she stepped onto the porch, something pulled her back. A force, invisible but undeniable, tugged at her, like hands wrapped around her ankles, dragging her back into the house. She spun around, looking at the dark, looming house. Its windows stared at her like eyes, cold and unblinking, watching her, judging her. The air around her felt charged, electric, as if something was about to break. And then she heard it. The voice. "It's too late, Emily. You never should have come back." Her heart stopped. The shadows were alive. The house was alive. And it wasn't going to let her go. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood frozen on the porch, her feet planted firmly on the wooden floorboards. Her mind raced with confusion, but the terror that gripped her chest left little room for rational thought. The voice was still in her head, its sinister whispers echoing in the empty spaces between her ears. "You never should have come back." The words repeated themselves like a mantra, a curse that weighed down her every breath. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the shadowy figure of her father. Something far worse had been waiting for her all along. But what? What was it? She turned to glance back at the house. The darkness within it seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The once comforting, familiar structure had become a prison. The windows stared out at her like hollow eyes, eyes that saw far too much. She shivered despite the warmth of the summer night. The night felt wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The faintest breeze that had once brought relief now only carried with it an unsettling chill. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees in the distance, sent spikes of anxiety through her spine. "Leave, Emily." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was sharp, demanding. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble in response, as if the very earth was urging her to flee. Emily took a step back, but her feet wouldn't move. Something had her rooted to the spot. A flash of memory crossed her mind. The attic, the figure that had once been her father, the feeling that something was wrong. The house was trying to tell her something, trying to make her remember. But what was it? What was she forgetting? Her eyes darted around the yard, searching for any sign of escape. The dark trees that surrounded the property loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes by the night. They were watching her too. The very world around her seemed to be closing in, suffocating her with its weight. "It's always been you, Emily." The voice came again, louder now, its tone filled with a dark promise. Her chest tightened as the words settled in her mind, sinking deeper into her soul. The house, the shadows, her father, none of it was random. None of it was coincidence. She was the key. She always had been. But to what? What had she been a part of? The air grew colder. Emily's breath came out in visible puffs, the night air biting at her skin. But it wasn't the temperature that was making her shiver. It was the creeping sense of dread that had settled deep within her bones, a coldness far more ancient and far more terrifying than anything the weather could bring. The ground beneath her feet shifted again. There was something moving beneath the earth, something that was alive. She jerked her head up, her eyes scanning the yard in frantic search of any explanation, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the house, and the oppressive darkness. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Her mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she didn't fully understand snapping into place, but every time she reached for the answer, it slipped further away, just out of reach. The truth about her family, about this house, it was buried deep, so deep she could feel it in her bones. She needed to remember. She had to remember. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for her like fingers hungry for a victim. She took another step back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her feet felt like they were dragging her, unwilling to go anywhere, unwilling to leave the house behind. But she had to leave. There was no other option. The house wasn't going to let her go. Not unless she understood what was happening. She turned and started walking quickly toward the dirt road that led away from the house, but each step felt like an eternity. Her pulse quickened with every footfall, her body urging her to keep moving to get as far away as possible. But the house was still behind her, its presence pressing down on her back, holding her in place, making it impossible to escape. "It's too late, Emily." The voice came again, so close it felt as if it was in her ear, a cruel, mocking whisper that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She stumbled, almost falling, but caught herself at the last second. She spun around, heart racing, her eyes wide as they scanned the area around her. Nothing. The yard was empty. The trees stood still, their branches swaying lazily in the wind. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness itself was alive, watching her every move. She felt its eyes on her, suffocating her, and for a moment she thought she might be losing her mind. "You have no idea what you've walked into?" Emily stopped in her tracks, her mind whirling with the implications of the voice. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. The house was alive. It had been waiting for her. But why? Why her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a car approaching. Relief surged through her for a split second, but it was fleeting. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, and Emily could see the shape of a figure standing near the edge of the woods, watching her. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human anatomy. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, cold, unblinking, and hungry. She took a step backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The car sped past, and in the moment of fleeting light, the figure disappeared into the darkness. Emily stood frozen, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and evil. But before she could move, the ground beneath her feet shifted again, this time violently. She screamed as the earth seemed to open up, a gaping maw of blackness that threatened to swallow her whole. She stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. "You can't leave. You'll never leave." The voice was now a full-bodied scream tearing through her mind. The earth beneath her feet was alive, pulsing, pulling her down into the abyss. She felt the ground give way, felt herself tumbling into the darkness, her body weightless. But as she fell, she realized one horrifying truth. It had all been waiting for her. All of it. And now it was too late to escape. Emily's world went black. The sound of her own scream was muffled by the overwhelming rush of air, the pounding of her heart deafening in her ears. Her body felt weightless, suspended in a never-ending fall. She tried to open her eyes, but the darkness was thick, consuming, and the ground seemed to drop away from her with every passing second. Her breath was sharp, ragged, as the air around her grew colder, biting at her skin with icy fingers. She reached out into the nothingness, but there was no ground, no walls, no familiar surroundings. Only emptiness. For a long moment, she felt as though she were trapped in a void, disconnected from everything. But the suffocating silence was soon shattered by the faintest sound, a whisper barely audible yet unmistakable. Emily? The voice, it had been following her for so long. Now it was closer than ever. She could almost feel it, the weight of its presence pressing in on her. She tried to call out, to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the blackness around her. "You can't escape." The words were unmistakable now, and they were more than just a warning, they were a declaration. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the voice seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with its force. It was as if the very air she breathed was thick with the weight of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for her to fall, to be swallowed whole. "You belong to me now." Her body jerked, her feet hitting solid ground, and she stumbled, her hands reaching out to catch herself. The fall had stopped, but the feeling of dread didn't. She was still in the dark, but now there was something else, something more. Her breath hitched as she slowly, cautiously rose to her feet, trying to make sense of her surroundings. It was no longer the familiar porch, no longer the yard. She was no longer outside. She was inside. A cold, damp stone floor stretched out before her, the walls dark and jagged, like a forgotten dungeon. She could barely make out the shapes around her, the shadows that twisted and shifted unnaturally. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the temperature was freezing, sending shivers down her spine. She tried to move, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Her entire body felt heavy, as though the very space she occupied was pressing against her. She could feel something beneath her skin, something that wasn't quite right, like the air itself was charged with malevolent energy. "Where am I?" she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips before they were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The shadows around her began to stretch and ripple, like liquid, curling into impossible shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The darkness was alive, and it was reaching for her. "You shouldn't have come back, Emily. You should have stayed away." The voice, her father's voice, echoed in her mind, but it didn't sound like him anymore. It was twisted, distorted, like something else was speaking through him. The terror she had felt earlier was nothing compared to the bone-chilling fear that now consumed her. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. Behind her, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed off the stone walls. She spun around, but there was no one there. Just the shadows stretching further and further into the abyss. "Look around you, Emily. See what's been waiting for you." The voice was everywhere now, coming from all directions, filling the space, crushing her under its weight. The shadows closed in, drawing her deeper into their grip. She tried to run, but her legs felt as though they were trapped in cement. Every step she took felt like a struggle, a fight against an invisible force that was pushing her back, holding her in place. Her heart pounded in her chest as the shadows seemed to twist into figures, human-like but twisted and grotesque. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, staring at her with an unblinking, unfeeling gaze. She could see their mouths move, but no sound came from them. Only whispers, whispers that echoed in her mind, urging her to listen. "You're ours now, Emily. Always have been. You never left. You were never meant to." A cold, sickening realization washed over her. These weren't just shadows. These were memories, fragments of her past, of her family, twisted and corrupted by whatever darkness had taken root in the house. Her mind flashed back to her childhood again, to the moment she had tried so desperately to forget. Her father's stern face, the times he had been absent, distant. The way her family had never been quite the same after they moved into the house. The whispers, the strange occurrences that had plagued her childhood, things she had pushed aside, convinced they were just nightmares. But now it was all coming back to her. The shadows began to move closer, their forms solidifying, becoming more real with each passing second. Their eyes glowed, a sickly yellow, and their mouths stretched wide into grotesque, twisted grins. They reached out to her, their hands gnarled and bony, their skin pale and cracked. "Join us, Emily." One of the figures stepped forward, its face coming into the light. Emily's heart stopped as she recognized it. It was her father, or at least what had once been her father. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide and vacant, hollow sockets that seemed to consume everything around them. "You were always meant to be here," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape us. You never could." She stumbled backward, her mind spinning with the horror of it all. How had it all gone so wrong? How had she ended up in this nightmare? The walls around her began to pulse, the shadows growing more and more oppressive, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel them closing in, their cold touch reaching out to grasp her, to pull her into the abyss. She could hear their whispers now, their voices overlapping, merging into a cacophony of madness. "You're ours, Emily. Forever." Her breathing became frantic as she struggled against the invisible hands that seemed to reach out for her from every direction. She fought with all her strength, but it was useless. The shadows were too strong, too powerful. The darkness had consumed everything, her home, her family, her past, and now it was coming for her. She could hear her father's voice again, but it wasn't comforting, it wasn't reassuring. It was the voice of something else, something that had taken over, something that wanted her soul. "There's no escape from this place, Emily. You'll never leave." Her body trembled, her mind on the brink of breaking as she realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the fear and despair of everyone who stepped foot inside. It had been waiting for her, and now it was taking everything from her. With one final scream, Emily collapsed to the floor, the weight of the shadows pressing down on her, drowning her in darkness. She had come too far, asked too many questions, and now there was no turning back. As the shadows closed in, her final thought echoed in her mind, was there ever a way out at all? And in that moment she knew. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone. It was just an ordinary school night, until the power went out. Sarah was the last one left in the building, alone in the quiet hallways trying to finish her homework. The empty classrooms felt eerie, but nothing could prepare her for what she'd find when she decided to take the long way home. A single flicker of light caught her attention down the hall, but as she turned the corner, the door slammed shut in front of her. From inside the room, she heard a faint sound, the scraping of a desk being dragged across the floor. She wasn't alone. Sarah had always stayed late to finish assignments, but tonight was different. The school had never been this quiet, not even during the late hours. As the last student left, the silence seemed to linger, unnaturally heavy. She was about to leave when the lights blinked, flickered, and went out entirely. Alone in the darkened hallway, Sarah's heart began to race, but she decided to finish her work, assuming it would only be a short while before the janitor would come through to reset the power. But there was a strange coldness in the air that kept her on edge. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the empty school. They were slow at first, but they got louder. As Sarah glanced around, hoping it was just someone else who stayed late, the footsteps abruptly stopped. She felt the presence of someone, or something, watching her. When she dared to leave her seat, the air grew colder. As Sarah approached the hall where the footsteps had stopped, a door slammed shut with a deafening sound. She froze. In the dim light of her phone, she could see something moving in the corner of her eye. A dark shadow. Slowly, the scraping of a desk against the floor could be heard from behind the door. Chapter 2: The Whispering Walls. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Sarah decided to investigate. The school had always been the setting for rumors. The old classrooms, the strange noises, and the unsettling feeling that someone was always watching. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but something about tonight felt different. As she moved through the halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were whispering. Her footsteps echoed back at her, too loud, too familiar. At the far end of the hall, she noticed a door that had never been there before. It was old, weathered, and covered in cobwebs, yet there was something inviting about it. Compelled, Sarah stepped toward the door. As she turned the handle, a voice whispered her name from the darkness. But when she opened it, she found only more darkness. Or was it? Something seemed to stir inside, and before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Chapter 3: The Forgotten Teacher. Trapped in the darkness, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The room felt suffocating, and the silence was oppressive. Just when she thought she might lose her mind, a faint light appeared in the distance. She followed it, hoping it was a way out, but what she found was far worse. In the corner of the room stood a figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, dressed in a teacher's uniform that seemed to belong to a time long past. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to make Sarah freeze. The figure seemed to tilt his head as if he recognized her. Suddenly, memories flooded Sarah's mind. A teacher who had disappeared years ago, rumored to have gone mad. No one had ever found his body, but the rumors of his ghost haunting the school never stopped. Was this him? Was he here to claim her soul too? Chapter 4: The Labyrinth Beneath. Sarah's escape attempt led her to an unexpected discovery, a hidden staircase leading down into a dark basement. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with old lockers, each one containing something that seemed out of place. There were books that hadn't been touched in decades, photographs of past students who had long since graduated, and strange symbols carved into the walls. The deeper she went, the more the temperature dropped. Her breath misted in front of her as she heard a noise from below, a loud thudding like something or someone moving in the shadows. She had to get out, but the closer she got to the exit, the more the darkness seemed to close in around her. And then she saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. She had no choice but to run, but the labyrinth beneath the school seemed endless. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Classmates. In her frantic escape, Sarah stumbled into an old classroom, one that looked untouched by time. Inside, she found her old classmates, but they were no longer the people she remembered. They were different. Their eyes were wide, glassy, as if trapped in a trance. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They only stared. As Sarah tried to reach them, she heard a voice behind her. The teacher. The one who had disappeared years ago. "They're not real," he whispered. "They're just echoes. Trapped like me." Sarah ran, but she couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around her, that she was being watched from every corner. Chapter 6: The Entity. It wasn't just the teacher anymore. There was something else, something older, something that lived in the very walls of the school. Sarah could feel it, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for her to make a mistake. As she wandered the hallways, the entity followed her, a dark shadow that seemed to be always one step behind. It whispered in her ear, telling her things she couldn't understand, but every word made her heart race. Every shadow felt like a hand reaching out to pull her into the darkness. She had to confront it or she would be lost forever. Chapter 7. The Final Hour. In the final confrontation, Sarah found herself face to face with the entity. It was a creature of pure darkness, its form shifting with every blink. It knew her deepest fears and it used them against her. She tried to run, but the halls had turned into a maze, trapping her in a loop of endless terror. In the end, the school was no longer a place of learning. It was a prison. And as Sarah faced the entity one last time, she realized there was no way out. Not for her. Not for anyone who dared to stay after hours. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest as she stood in the hallway, staring at the dark, closed door in front of her. The footsteps she had heard earlier had stopped, and the eerie silence that followed felt almost like a trap. She couldn't ignore the strange sensation crawling up her spine, like eyes watching her from every corner of the school. The power was still out, the only light coming from the faint glow of her phone. Sarah turned, the dim light from her screen flickering, casting long shadows down the hallway. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she took a deep breath. There had to be an explanation. The sound she'd heard, the footsteps, the slamming door, the scraping noise, had to have a logical reason. It was just an old school. Things creaked, things groaned. But something told her that tonight was different. The coldness in the air was unnatural, and the silence around her felt thick, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. Her mind raced, questioning if she was imagining everything. But then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like a soft breeze speaking her name. Her blood ran cold. Sarah? The voice was distant, a whisper that seemed to echo from the very walls. It was as if the school itself was alive, breathing, calling her. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. Something was moving just beyond her line of sight. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Sarah, don't go. Her heart skipped a beat. Her breath quickened. What was that? She wasn't alone. The whisper wasn't just in her head. It was real. It was coming from the walls. She took a hesitant step forward, trying to make sense of the situation, but the air around her seemed to grow even colder. The hairs on her arms prickled, the silence so deafening that she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. As Sarah turned the corner, she noticed something strange. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. She hadn't noticed it before. It was an old storage closet, the one that no one had used in years, yet it stood open. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to stay away, but she couldn't help herself. Something pulled her towards it. She moved closer, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and as she reached for the handle, a chill swept over her. It was sudden, like a blast of cold air hitting her from all sides, freezing her to the bone. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the handle, twisting it slowly. The door creaked as it opened further, revealing a small, dark room beyond. A room she knew all too well, one that had been sealed off years ago after an incident. The whispers grew louder now, filling the space around her, urging her forward. Sarah, you shouldn't be here. The voice was different this time. It was deep, almost guttural, like it had been pulled from the depths of the earth. And yet it felt strangely familiar. The air grew thick with tension, and her head spun with questions, confusion, and fear. Who was speaking? And why did the voice seem to come from everywhere? A faint rustle interrupted her thoughts. Something moved in the shadows within the room, just out of reach of the dim light. Sarah, come closer. Without thinking, her feet carried her forward, her body acting on instinct. Every step felt like she was being drawn into a trap, but she couldn't stop. The door creaked as it opened wider, the darkness within seeming to swallow her whole. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but then she saw it. A figure, tall, thin, with long bony fingers stretched out towards her from the corner of the room. It was standing perfectly still, but there was something wrong with the figure. Its body was unnaturally rigid, almost like a mannequin, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Those eyes seemed to stare directly at her, filled with something she couldn't describe, hunger, malice, or maybe something even worse. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized it wasn't just the voice she recognized. It was the figure, the one who had been rumored to haunt this school, the one that had disappeared without a trace all those years ago. The teacher. His name echoed in her mind, Mr. Ashford. Mr. Ashford had vanished under mysterious circumstances long before Sarah was even born. Some said he had gone mad, others claimed he had died in the school, but no one had ever found any evidence. No one knew the truth. Until now. Until she had stumbled upon this forgotten corner of the school, hidden away from prying eyes. Why are you here? Sarah's voice trembled, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from his empty eyes. The figure tilted its head slowly, the movement unervingly smooth as if it didn't belong to a human body. It was as though it had been watching her for longer than she'd realized. You came looking for answers. Mr. Ashford's voice was now clearer, almost like a sigh escaping from a hidden source. But some things are better left untouched. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as though they carried a warning she didn't fully understand. The room grew colder, the shadows creeping further along the walls. The silence deepened, broken only by the soft scrape of the figure's footsteps as it moved toward her, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, the lights in the hallway flickered. For a moment, the darkness engulfed them both, and when the lights returned, Mr. Ashford was gone. The door slammed shut on its own, trapping Sarah inside the room, her heart racing, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She wasn't alone. Something was waiting for her. She wasn't sure if she wanted to find out what. The door slammed shut behind her, its heavy thud echoing through the room. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The faint flicker of her phone's light illuminated the room in ghostly shades, casting long shadows across the old, forgotten classroom. Her mind raced. What had just happened? Mr. Ashford. He had been standing right there, those glowing eyes boring into hers. But now there was no trace of him. No sign that anyone had ever been in the room. Only the same peeling wallpaper, the dusty desks, and the faint scent of something long decayed. But something felt wrong. Something was off, and it was more than just the coldness that wrapped around her. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something. Something that had been waiting in the dark for years, hidden from view. Her fingers clenched around her phone, the only thing that connected her to reality in this place. She turned in a circle, searching for any hint of movement, any sign that she wasn't alone. But there was nothing. Nothing but the faint hum of the school's ancient pipes, the creaking of the old floorboards beneath her feet. Then she heard it, a soft whisper barely audible. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves, like a secret too dark to be spoken aloud. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come back." Her skin prickled. The voice was low, almost a growl, as though it came from the depths of the earth. But there was no one there. No one except the shadows, stretching long and ominous in the corners of the room. The whispering grew louder, and she felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper itself, trembling with fear. She wasn't sure who she was speaking to. Was it Mr. Ashford? The entity that had been haunting the school for years? Or something else entirely? The air grew colder still, and she could see her breath now, white puffs in the dim light. The temperature in the room had dropped so suddenly that it felt as though the very bones of the school were frozen. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself to keep warm, but it didn't help. The chill seemed to come from inside her, gnawing at her insides, burrowing deep into her chest. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the voice came again, closer this time, as if it were right behind her. "You never should have come to this place. It's not what you think. None of this is." Sarah spun around, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, save for the dust and the remnants of forgotten lessons. Yet the voice lingered, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible hand. She stumbled back, her foot catching on something hidden beneath the layers of dust on the floor. She looked down and saw a small old book. The cover was worn, its edges frayed with age. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she bent down to pick it up, dusting it off carefully. The book was heavy in her hands, its pages yellowed with time. It didn't look like something that belonged in this forgotten classroom. And yet there it was, waiting for her. She opened it slowly, the faint crackling of the pages filling the room. The book was old, too old. The ink was smudged in places, but Sarah could make out a few words. Ashford. History. The truth. Her stomach churned. She had heard rumors, stories whispered among the few teachers who still worked at the school. There were talks of strange things happening in this building, of disappearances, of dark forces at play. But nothing concrete, nothing that could explain what she was experiencing now. She turned the pages, the rustling of the paper the only sound in the room. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, but something told her this book was the key. Suddenly she froze. A name caught her eye. It was written on the page in thick, bold letters, as if it had been pressed there with great force. Sarah. The blood drained from her face. The name was unmistakable. Her name. How could it be here? The book was old, older than her, older than anything in this school. How could anyone have known her name, much less have written it in the book? She turned the page, her hands trembling, and her eyes scanned the next few lines. They were written in a hurried, almost frantic script. The girl who came after. She will know the truth, but it will cost her more than she's willing to give. The past will not let go. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words made no sense, but the warning was clear. The book wasn't just about the history of the school, it was a record of something darker. Something that had been waiting for someone like her to come along. And now she couldn't escape. The whispering grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, as though they were reaching for her. Sarah stood, the book still clutched tightly in her hands. She had to leave. She had to get out of this room, out of this building, before it was too late. But as she took a step toward the door, the floor beneath her creaked. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't her own. She turned around, her heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows that seemed to close in on her. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Sarah. The voice was back, now a low, guttural growl. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding her, pressing in on all sides. Without thinking, Sarah bolted for the door, the book still clutched in her hands. She yanked the door open, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't look back. She couldn't. As she ran down the hallway, the whispers followed, growing louder and louder with each step. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The book, the name, the warning. But the answers were out of reach. For now, the only thing Sarah knew for certain was this. Whatever was in this school, it wasn't finished with her yet. And it never would be. The hallway was dark. The cold had seeped deep into Sarah's bones as she ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty school like a haunting drumbeat. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to escape the suffocating grip of the shadows that seemed to claw at her heels. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the fear curling tight in her chest. She had to get out. She had to leave before whatever haunted this place found her again. But the hallway stretched on, endless and empty. No doors, no windows, only the faded lockers lining the walls, their metal doors rusted with age. Her phone's dim light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. In the distance, she heard the faintest sound, a thud. A door slamming? A footstep? It was impossible to tell. She kept running, her legs growing heavier with each step. Something was wrong. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing down on her shoulders. The walls felt like they were closing in inch by inch. Then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a mirror. A large, old-fashioned mirror, framed in dark wood. It was an odd sight in this place, she had never noticed it before. The glass was cracked, shards missing in places, and the edges were jagged like broken teeth. Despite its condition, it seemed to gleam faintly in the darkness. Sarah felt a strange pull toward it. She stopped, her body moving of its own accord, drawn toward the mirror like a moth to a flame. As she drew closer, she noticed something in the reflection, something behind her. But there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The air was still. She stared at the cracked surface of the mirror, her reflection fragmented and distorted by the jagged shards of glass. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. The fear in her eyes was unfamiliar, as if someone else was looking back at her. And then the whispering began again. Sarah? The voice was closer now, almost in her ear. The words seemed to come from the mirror itself, vibrating through the glass like a sinister hum. Sarah, don't look too long. She froze. Her heart hammered in her chest. The voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a presence, a force that seemed to resonate in the very fabric of the school. It was as though the school itself was trying to warn her, trying to pull her away from the mirror. But Sarah couldn't look away. The reflection in the mirror was changing. The broken glass began to twist, warping her image until it was no longer just her face staring back. Instead, it was a face she didn't recognize, a man's face. His eyes glowed faintly, like they were burning with some unnatural light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips curled into a wicked grin. A cold, icy shiver ran down her spine as she realized who it was. Mr. Ashford. But his face wasn't the only thing in the mirror. Behind him, she saw something else, shadows. Dark, shifting figures that moved with a life of their own. They slithered across the glass like smoke, twisting and contorting, their forms impossible to define. "Get away from the mirror, Sarah," the voice growled. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But it was too late. The mirror began to crack, the glass splintering like ice breaking apart, sending shards tumbling to the floor with a deafening crash. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and Sarah felt a weight settle over her, pressing her down. She stumbled backward, but her feet refused to move. Her body was frozen, locked in place by an unseen force. The shadows in the mirror were moving faster now, growing larger, closer. And then she saw something, someone, emerging from the glass. It was Mr. Ashford. But he wasn't the man she had seen earlier. No, this figure was different. His face was distorted, twisted, as though he had been stretched and pulled beyond recognition. His eyes, now hollow and dark, stared at her with an intensity that made her want to scream. He reached out toward her, his hands slipping through the shards of the broken mirror like it wasn't even there. The glass cut through him, but he didn't bleed. Instead, a dark mist poured from the cracks, swirling around his figure, enveloping him in a cloak of darkness. Sarah tried to move, to scream, but her throat felt tight as if something was choking her from the inside. The shadows in the mirror began to reach toward her, their tendrils snaking out like fingers, brushing against her skin. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again. "You should never have come here." The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and Sarah could see her breath fogging up in the air. The mirror was alive. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a gateway, a door to something much darker. And the longer she stayed here, the more she realized she couldn't escape it. But then, as quickly as it had started, the mirror's shadows began to pull back. The mist dissipated, and the reflection returned to its shattered state. Mr. Ashford's face vanished. The darkness faded, and the hallway was still again. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her body shaking from the sheer terror of what she had just witnessed. She wasn't sure what had happened. Was it a hallucination? Was it real? The mirror was still shattered, but the reflection, it was gone. But as Sarah turned to leave, she heard something else. A whisper, soft and barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Sarah?" She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The mirror was empty again. There was nothing in it, nothing but the jagged shards of glass. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. Something was waiting for her, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, a rhythmic pounding that echoed through her ears as she backed away from the shattered mirror. The fragments of glass lay scattered across the floor like broken dreams, each shard gleaming with a sinister gleam under the pale light. Her feet moved in slow, hesitant steps, as though her body knew that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. She could still feel the cold, bitter air that had surrounded her moments ago, and the whispers that had crawled into her mind like unwanted insects. "Sarah." The voice, deep and raspy, reverberated in her skull, its echoes refusing to leave. It had come from the mirror, but now, it was everywhere. It was in the walls. It was in the air. It was in her. She turned quickly, trying to shake off the suffocating feeling of being watched. There had to be an exit. There had to be a way out. The hallways of the school twisted and turned like a labyrinth, each corner seemingly leading her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something kept pulling her forward. She couldn't explain it. Was it the book she'd found? Was it the name written in it? Or was it something else? Something dark, ancient, and malevolent that had been watching her all along, waiting for the right moment to strike? As she walked down the hallway, the silence grew thicker, almost oppressive. Her shoes scuffed against the old wooden floor, the sound swallowed up by the gloom that stretched ahead of her. The lockers were all the same, old, rusted, and abandoned. The dim light flickered overhead, casting fleeting shadows that danced in the corners of her vision. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the dark. But when she looked again, there was nothing, just the hollow silence. But then she heard it. A door creaked open from somewhere ahead. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. The sound had been faint, distant, but unmistakable. She wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was here with her. Her breath quickened, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone, the dim glow illuminating her shaking fingers. She tried to focus on the screen, on the safety of her phone, but the screen flickered and died. The sudden blackness made her panic, her heart racing in her chest like a drumbeat. And then another sound, a laugh. It was low, guttural, and drawn out, like the sound of nails scraping against a chalkboard. It came from the darkness ahead, a sound that made her skin crawl and her insides twist with dread. It wasn't a human laugh. It was something else, something not quite alive. The hallway stretched on, but something was different now. The air had thickened, and the walls seemed to be closing in on her. She felt it, this overwhelming sensation that something was right behind her, watching, waiting. But when she turned around, there was nothing. No one. Yet the feeling remained, like an invisible hand on the back of her neck, urging her to move forward. She took a shaky breath, forcing her legs to move, dragging herself deeper into the school. The door creaked again, louder this time. It was coming from the end of the hallway, the very end where the light was weakest. It was the last door in the corridor, one that Sarah had never seen before. It wasn't supposed to be there. The hallway should have ended right after the classroom, but there it was, an old, weathered door standing out like a wound in the fabric of the school. She had to know what was behind it. She didn't want to, but something pushed her forward, a pull she couldn't resist. She walked toward it, her steps slow, calculated, as though her body knew what was waiting beyond but couldn't stop itself. Her hand reached out toward the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shock through her fingers as she turned it. The door opened with a low, dragging creak, revealing a dark room beyond. It was empty, or at least it looked empty at first. Her eyes darted across the room, scanning every inch of it. There was nothing but dust and old furniture, broken chairs, overturned desks, and a thick layer of grime on the floor. It looked like no one had been in here for years. But then she noticed something out of place. A shadow. It wasn't just a regular shadow. It was darker than the rest, almost like it had substance, like it was alive. It moved across the room, slithering along the walls as though it had a mind of its own. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She could feel its presence like an overwhelming weight in the air, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She stepped into the room, her body moving almost without thinking, drawn toward the shadow. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in as if they wanted to crush her. And then the voice. It was a whisper at first, just a flicker in the air. But it grew louder, rising in pitch until it was almost a scream. The words were jumbled, but Sarah could make out a few. "You shouldn't be here." Her skin prickled as the voice surrounded her, reverberating through the walls like a deep, resonating hum. The shadow in the room grew larger, stretching toward her, its form becoming clearer. It was no longer just a shadow. It had shape, human shape. The outline of a man, but his features were distorted, twisted, like a grotesque caricature. Sarah froze, her legs unwilling to move, her body paralyzed by fear. The shadow lurched toward her, its shape shifting with every movement. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. The figure reached out, and Sarah could see the outlines of hands, long and claw-like, stretching toward her. "You should never have come back," it hissed. The voice was different now. It wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds, overlapping each other, echoing through her mind, like a chorus of tortured souls. The room began to spin, the walls twisting and warping, and she could feel the floor beneath her start to give way. Suddenly, everything went black. Sarah awoke with a start, gasping for air as if she'd been submerged in water. Her heart hammered in her chest, the rapid thumping echoing in her ears. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around her like a thick blanket, but there was something more to it, something alive. It was as though the shadows themselves were watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Her body felt heavy, her limbs numb, but she managed to push herself up, her hands scraping against something rough, something hard. She couldn't tell where she was. The coldness of the air told her she was still in the school, but this was different. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The room around her was pitch black, the air so thick she could barely breathe. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, the oppressive weight of the darkness closing around her, squeezing the life out of her. Then the whispers came. Soft at first, like a faint breeze brushing her ears. It was a voice, a familiar voice, one she had heard before, though she couldn't quite place it. Sarah. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Her stomach twisted in fear. She knew that voice. She had heard it earlier in the mirror in the hallway, but now it was clearer, more insistent, like it was right behind her, just inches away from her ear. She spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Her breath caught in her throat. The walls, they were breathing. The sound was subtle at first, like a low groan or the creak of an old house settling. But as she listened more closely, she realized it wasn't just the house. It was the walls themselves, shifting, groaning in rhythm. The walls were alive. She backed away, her hands scraping along the cold, uneven surface of the stone. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, growing louder but somehow wrong. The sound seemed to distort, to twist in the air as if it didn't belong in this place. She tried to steady her breathing, to calm herself, but the fear was consuming her. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were something more, something darker, something that wanted her to stay. The whispering grew louder until it surrounded her completely. It was no longer one voice, it was hundreds, thousands of voices, all muttering in a strange foreign language that sent a chill down her spine. The words were nonsensical, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling to her, pulling her deeper into their grip. Sir, come closer. She stumbled back, her hands trembling. She couldn't stop herself from moving forward. The walls, the shadows, they were drawing her in, making her feel like she didn't have a choice. She felt the air change, the temperature dropping. Her breath came out in visible clouds, the cold seeping into her skin, into her bones. Her teeth chattered, but she couldn't look away from the walls. The voices grew louder still, their whispers turning into chants, rhythmic and hypnotic. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, the entire room shaking as though it were alive. The walls pulsed with an unnatural energy, the whispers becoming screams. The sound echoed in her skull, deafening, overwhelming. Sarah, you cannot escape. Her heart was racing now, her pulse pounding in her temples. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were frozen in place, her feet glued to the floor. The walls seemed to be closing in, inch by inch, squeezing her into the center of the room. The air was suffocating, the shadows creeping along the floor, the ceiling, the walls. Everywhere she looked, they were there, their dark forms shifting and moving in ways that didn't make sense. Then a crack. A loud, snapping sound filled the room as the wall to her left cracked open, splitting down the center. Sarah gasped, her body trembling as she stepped back, but the crack grew wider. The voices screamed louder, their chants growing more frantic. She turned toward the new opening, her body forced forward by some unseen force. The crack widened until it formed a doorway, an entrance into the darkness. Sarah felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward it, the whispers growing deafening. She wanted to look away. She wanted to run. But she couldn't. As she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped again. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, the smell of something long forgotten. And then she saw it. The hallway stretched before her, long, narrow, and endless. But this was no ordinary hallway. The walls were covered in scratches, long, deep gouges, as though something had clawed its way through them. The floor was covered in dirt, the air thick with the scent of old blood. And then the whispers returned. This time they were clearer. Sarah. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, but she knew it wasn't in her mind. The walls, the air, it was all part of this place. The whispers were coming from every direction, crawling under her skin, slipping into her thoughts, wrapping around her heart. Come closer. She took one hesitant step forward, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her legs refused to obey her commands, but something forced her to keep going, to keep moving down the endless hallway. She had to know what was at the end. She had to see it. There was no turning back now. The darkness ahead grew thicker, more suffocating. And then, as Sarah's foot hit the floor with a soft thud, something shifted. The wall to her right cracked open again, this time revealing a figure, a silhouette, a person. Or was it? It was standing still just on the other side of the crack, shrouded in darkness. Sarah could make out no features, just the outline of a figure tall and thin. But something about it felt wrong. It didn't belong here. The whispers turned into a low growl, a growl that sent ice through Sarah's veins. And then the figure stepped into the light. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Mr. Ashford. But his face wasn't human anymore. Sarah stood frozen in the dark hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in shallow, quick bursts, fogging the air in front of her. She tried to steady herself, but the terror gnawing at her insides made it nearly impossible. Every step she took felt like an eternity, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers, the chants, were still there, creeping into her mind, relentless and suffocating. Her feet scraped against the cold, uneven floor as she slowly moved deeper into the hallway, her body trembling uncontrollably. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing with each step, as if the very building itself was alive and intent on trapping her here. The air grew colder with every breath, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath cloud in the dim light. Sarah. That voice. That same voice. It had followed her from the very first moment she stepped into the school, whispering, beckoning, calling to her like a dark force she couldn't escape. She tried to ignore it, to push it out of her mind, but it was impossible. It was everywhere. The walls, the shadows, the air, they all seemed to carry the voice, and it was becoming stronger with every passing second. Sarah, come closer. Her skin prickled as if thousands of unseen eyes were watching her. She could feel the weight of it, the oppressive presence closing in on her from every direction. She stopped for a moment, her eyes darting around the hallway, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just the oppressive blackness, the haunting whispers. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. The walls, no, the entire school, was shifting, groaning as though it were alive, as though it was aware of her every move, every breath. The strange, unsettling noises came from all directions, reverberating through the hallway, but the whispers, those whispered chants, they were louder now, almost deafening. Sarah. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a beckoning, an insistent pull that seemed to be dragging her forward, guiding her to the source of the darkness. Every instinct in her told her to run, to turn and flee, but her legs refused to obey. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The hallway stretched on forever, its end hidden in the shadows, unreachable. Every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into the maze of fear. Her chest tightened, her breath growing more erratic as she moved. She didn't know how much longer she could take it. The walls were closing in, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The floor beneath her feet trembled slightly, and the ceiling creaked as though something was shifting, something ancient and malevolent. Come closer. The voice was now unmistakable, clear and loud, echoing through the hallway like a deep, guttural growl. It sent a shock of terror through her, causing her to freeze in place. The walls seemed to bend inwards, warping around her, tightening their grip on her as if to trap her in a cage. Her mind raced. She tried to think, tried to find a way out, but there was nothing. There was no escape. The darkness was all-consuming, and the whispers, now growing into a frenzied chant, were driving her mad. Sarah. The voice was coming from everywhere now, from inside her head, from the walls, from the very air she breathed. It felt like it was inside her skin and her blood, burrowing deep into her bones. And then there was a sound, a distant, hollow thud. It echoed from behind her, sending a jolt of panic through her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her throat. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, empty hallway. Yet that feeling, that overwhelming sense of being watched, of being hunted, didn't go away. The thud came again, closer this time. And then again, even closer. She turned around to face the sound, her eyes desperately scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. Her legs felt weak beneath her, her muscles shaking, but she forced herself to keep moving. There was no time to waste. She had to find out what was happening. She had to know the truth. Sir. The whisper was in her ear now. It was so close she could feel the cold breath against her skin. She turned, but again, nothing. No one was there. The hallway was empty. Her heart skipped a beat as she heard another sound, this time unmistakable. It was a shuffle, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking toward her. She wasn't alone. But when she looked around, there was no one there. "Come closer." The voice, so soothing and insistent, echoed in her mind, wrapping around her like a tight coil, squeezing the breath out of her. The walls seemed to pulse with life, their surfaces groaning as though they were alive, watching her every move. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to run. She turned and sprinted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick, suffocating. She could barely breathe, but she didn't stop. She had to keep running, keep moving, away from the voice, away from the darkness. She was running blind, her eyes searching the shadows, the twisted hallway stretching out in all directions. But the further she ran, the darker it became. The shadows seemed to press in, to close in on her from all sides. She could hear it now, the soft patter of footsteps behind her, the shuffle of something moving just out of sight. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were screams. Screams that filled the air, that rattled her bones. "Sir." The sound was deafening now, as though the walls themselves were alive with it, the very air thick with their presence. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a figure. A silhouette standing motionless in the shadows. Its outline was tall, thin, and unnaturally still, like a mannequin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring at it. The figure was so familiar, so wrong, and her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. Mr. Ashford. But his face wasn't human anymore. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto Sarah's. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The fear had choked her throat. Her legs froze. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't run. The whispers returned, louder now, demanding, insistent. And then she realized it wasn't just a figure standing there. It was waiting for her. And whatever was in that shadow, the thing she had been running from all this time, was ready to take her. And then, just before the world swallowed her whole, she heard the last whisper, an ominous promise. "You can't escape.